more about Planet of the Humans?
Yes, we got the message in that new documentary executive produced by Michael Moore. We humans have outgrown the planet and technology cannot save us. But what do we do about that?
Find out next on the GrowthBusters podcast.
Calling. Call the GrowthBusters. Whoa.
Welcome to the GrowthBusters podcast. We're finding the cure for society's addiction to growth and doing our best to chart a sustainable course for human civilization. I'm Dave Gardner, GrowthBuster-in-Chief.
And I'm Erica Arias, Deputy GrowthBuster. For cutting-edge information about our culture's unsustainable love affair with growth and what we can do about it, visit growthbusters.org.
Erica, in a previous episode, we shared the webinar that GrowthBusters co-hosted, Planet of the Humans, a sequel. What did the film get right, and what should we do about it?
Right. And we ran out of time on that webinar and didn't finish answering that second question. So we invited panelists back for a part 2. We posted that video on the GrowthBusters YouTube channel, and we're sharing that audio now in this podcast.
Yep. If you can't sit still for nearly 2 hours to watch a video, you can just listen to the podcast while you do your cardio, water the kale, turn the compost, cook dinner, and wash dishes. For a week.
Before we get to the webinar, I want to mention that we'll put links in the show notes to the webinar video and to the new review of The Planet of the Humans by William Rees, co-originator of Ecological Footprint.
Yeah, that was published in the Steady State Herald over at CASI, the Center for the Advancement of the Steady State Economy. And Bill Rees is just one of the smartest sustainability experts I know. Everything he writes is just brilliant. So this is a must-read. So get that link in the show notes.
Definitely. And now to the panel.
Well, welcome to this follow-up. You could call it part 2 of the webinar, Planet of the Humans, a sequel. We struggled to come up with a good title for this video and podcast episode, and in fact, we haven't settled on a name yet as we record this. I proposed, Is the Future So Bright We Gotta Wear Shades? Brian Check, of course, suggested Planet of the Humans, a Steady State sequel, which is pretty apropos too, I think. But regardless of name, we're going to finish answering the second of the 2 questions about the controversial Planet of the Humans film that we posed in the first webinar. Those 2 questions were, what did the film get right, and what should we do about it? Both of these discussions are co-hosted by World Population Balance and GrowthBusters, with a very strong assist by the Center for the Advancement of the Steady State Economy. We'll tell you a little bit more about these 3 nonprofits as we wrap up the discussion in a little bit. First, let's do quick introductions. I'm Dave Gardner. I started the GrowthBusters Public Education Project and co-host with Erica Arias the GrowthBusters podcast about sustainable living. And I also serve as executive director of World Population Balance, where with Erica, again, I co-host the Overpopulation podcast. Joining me today are Kristine Mattis. If you want to tell us a little bit about yourself real quick.
Sure. I'm Kristine Mattis. I'm an environmental scholar and writer, and my studies and writing are at the intersection of science and justice and health. And I focus on things like toxicology and environmental justice and environmental communication. And my doctoral degree is an highly interdisciplinary degree that involves natural and social sciences in environment and resources. And I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for joining us. And Brian Check.
Hi, I'm Brian Check. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for the Advancement of the Steady State Economy. That's at steadystate.org. And I'm also happy to be here.
Well, I'm glad you're happy to be here. Erica Arias, are you happy to be here too?
I'm happy to be here, Dave. Hi, I'm Erica Arias, co-host and co-producer of the GrowthBusters podcast and the Overpopulation podcast. I am going to soon become an environmental sociology graduate student at the University of Oregon this fall, and I am an advocate for child-free living.
Well, thank you, all 3 of you, for agreeing to come back to, I don't suppose we'll ever really finish the conversation, but we left a lot on the table when we wrapped up that webinar on May 19th. Breaking news, of course, by the time you actually get to see this or you're hearing this as a podcast, it'll be a little bit older news. But first of all, the Planet of the Humans team apparently decided to extend the free run on YouTube beyond 30 days. But just a little less than a week after that decision, the film got pulled down off of YouTube. Copyright infringement had been filed by someone who claims that a little bit of their film footage is included in the film, and they did not grant permission or rights for use of that footage in the film. So YouTube immediately takes it down and gives the filmmaker a chance to appeal the decision, and I guess they're still in that process. Being a lifelong filmmaker myself and getting a lot of education about fair use, which is apparently what the filmmakers are claiming for that footage, I don't really think it's going to go back on YouTube in its current form. I think they're going to end up having to edit the film to take that footage out. But it's kind of interesting that the person whose footage is the subject of all this has said, apparently he told The Guardian that he didn't agree with the film. Otherwise, he might have just been fine with letting them use the footage. But he took issue with the platform of the film, so he was not going to give them permission, and he filed that copyright notice. Any comments about that, gang?
I don't want to be conspiracy theorist, but, conspiracies come from somewhere. And it's very clear that since this film went up on YouTube for free and had so many millions of viewers, there were big voices and big powerful people who wanted to get it down immediately. And I have a feeling that there are powerful people who've been looking for a way to get it down. And so they were looking for anything they could. And I have a feeling that this was one of the avenues that they found. And, there's a lot of people on that side that don't think this film should be shown and think it should be banned. And so I think they probably found the one person who could do it for them. I have a feeling they've been looking for a while.
Well, that could very well be. It wouldn't surprise me, because there certainly has been a concerted effort to keep the film from getting so many eyeballs. Of course, that effort itself makes the film that much more attractive to a lot of people. Yeah. And, the more public conversation there is around the film, the more convinced I am that of its importance, that it's really important. I think the filmmakers maybe made a few errors in judgment about what they included and how they presented it, but the film is a whole lot more right than wrong, that's for sure. And so here we are, continuing to talk about it and dig into it. One more thing that I thought you guys might find noteworthy is that there was a new piece published at Common Dreams written by Jamie Henn, director of Fossil Free Media and one of the co-founders of 350.org, which is one of the organizations that Planet of the Humans accuses of glossing over the truth, kind of selling us a pipe dream about renewable energy being the final answer, and not necessarily telling us about all the other hard work that we need to do to really achieve sustainability for human civilization. But I found this piece that Jamie Henn wrote really pretty good illustration of this marketing approach that I think got the climate NGOs and renewable energy advocates in trouble with the filmmaker Jeff Gibbs to begin with. Though the headline alone, "Our greener, climate-friendly future is going to be amazing. It's our job to tell that story." And he advises the readers to sell the sizzle of a clean energy future. And Kristine, I'm sure you read that. In fact, I think you brought that to my attention. You did such a good job in your piece on Medium of explaining the marketing PR side of this story. So I imagine you probably pinned this up on your bulletin board to remind.
Yeah, I alluded to it in our last webinar, and I think some people thought I was saying that Bill McKibben had written it, because I couldn't remember Jamie's name at the time, but it wasn't Bill McKibben. However, it does show the marketing of, say, the Green New Deal and of what we might want to call the new climate movement or the new environmental movement, that we are going to have a high-tech, wonderful future, and we are going to get off of all of fossil fuels and just basically live very similarly to how we live now. And like you said, even in the headline, it says, we are here to tell this story, to basically sell this future to you. It's funny because some of the detractors of Planet of the Humans were saying that the right wing has glommed onto the film to promote their, fossil fuel future, and that to say that, see, we can't live without fossil fuels. This is proof. But I think promoting a quote unquote sustainable future that is not realistic at all is fuel for that same right wing to promote some lies about living the same way we do and living that way without any ecological repercussions is just not realistic. And it serves the same right wing that these people have said that the film serves. So that's what I see as problematic. And anytime you are marketing something, marketing is a form of manipulation. It's a form of telling half-truths. Go back to Edward Bernays, who created this whole marketing and PR system. It wasn't meant to tell people truths about the reality. It was meant to sell people things and sell people a way of life. And if we are going to use those same tools to market the environment, we are doomed because we are bound to fail. It is not truth. And I don't know how we combat the marketing machine that is against us, that is against the environmental movement as a whole, but using their same tools to promote something that is not real and not really sustainable, I don't think is the way to do it either.
Green new sizzle.
Yeah.
But you raise an important point that I think we need to acknowledge and keep in mind as we explore solutions, which we're about to dig into, because Hen referred to a piece in the New York Times about how conservatives are starting to use the economic challenges of the COVID-19 shutdown to incite fear of the coming Green New Deal. They're saying, this is what a carbon-constrained world will look like. Isn't this miserable? I think we're going to every now and then have to put on our marketing hats, Kristine, and figure out a way to beat them at that game.
Well, part of it, I think, is this dichotomy. I mean, in terms of this COVID crisis, they're saying that, the Green New Deal is going to be a hell because look at the hell we're facing for the economy. Well, we didn't have to have this hell for the economy. What we have is a two-party system that is not offering us alternatives for what could be happening during this COVID crisis. We could be giving a universal basic income to everybody right now, like many other countries are doing. We could be giving Medicare for all to everyone, and we wouldn't be going through this economic crisis, and we could still be shut down, and we can still have people living a decent life through this, like many of the other nations, particularly I'm thinking of Spain, are doing. In fact, Spain is nationalizing a lot of their previously private programs in order to affect that change. They've changed it now, they're going to change it in the future. And so I think part of it is that we are not imagining all the possibilities. We have this one possibility from the so-called right, one possibility from the so-called left, and there's a plethora of other possibilities that are being off the table, and maybe that's what needs to be put out there.
Well, I think we'll get into that today, so that makes me even more excited about the conversation. I don't want to make the preamble take an hour, but I do want to offer one other thing that I was thinking earlier today about the things I wish I had said during the webinar. And I know one of the things that was a catalyst for us hosting these two sessions was that so many people who saw Planet of the Humans were disappointed that the film didn't offer solutions. And I just want to, as a filmmaker, stand up a little bit for the filmmaker, but also in a way kind of set the stage for what we're doing today. I think that Jeff Gibbs needed, before offering solutions, he really needed to make the case for what the problem is that needs solutions. And it took a film to do that. But additionally, I think it would be pretty arrogant of a filmmaker, or even arrogant of us, to assume that we have all the solutions. No one does. No one has all the solutions. So the goal, I think, is for everyone who is seeking solutions, considering them, discussing, promoting, or implementing solutions. We want everybody involved in that to have all of that be informed by the fundamental truth that we've gotten too big for our planet and technology alone can't fix that. So we're going to talk about solutions today and some suggestions, but I don't think we have all the magic answers, and we won't even give everybody a detailed recipe or to-do list for all the things that we think should be on the table. But we'll give you enough that you can, what you might want to explore and what you might want to try. But if you walk away from having seen that film, from having watched or listened to our discussions, if you walk away with this new operating system in your head that says, bigger isn't better, we just can't keep on chasing more, then the things that you come up with they'll be more appropriate. You'll come up with solutions instead of more problems for us to solve. Fair enough? Mm-hmm. Okay. Gary Wachner wrote, he's an environmental writer, and he's director of the Save the Colorado River organization. River's not in the name of the organization, but that's what he's talking about with Save the Colorado. He wrote a review of Planet of the Humans, and he said something pretty insightful, I thought, which was that the film forces a necessary discussion about what environmentalism needs to become, which is a comprehensive critique and advocacy against human overpopulation, overconsumption, and overdevelopment. Really are looking here for a way for some common goals that everybody in the environmental movement can get behind. We do not want to pick fights with 350.org or Sierra Club or any renewable energy advocates. We all really have the same goals in mind. So today, let's talk a little bit about aspirations, but let's really try to drill down to the practical steps that I think everybody's dying to hear about. That would be a rational response to the news that technology can't save us. So what I want to know is if we can agree to start with that we have two big buckets of solutions that we want to talk about. One bucket, things that we can do to contract the global economy, and another bucket, things that we can do to contract the global human population. Do I have agreement on that, or am I missing a bucket?
Those are two big buckets.
And daunting, too. Okay,
and
no one's contesting that?
Yes.
Okay. Some people are going to think that we can work on one bucket and solve the problem. In fact, I think it's fair to say there are people in the world with both opinions. Some think that we can ignore human overpopulation and still get into sustainable mode. And some people think that we can just focus on human overpopulation and keep on living as high on the hog as we are today and solve the problem. And I'm betting that everybody at the table today here would disagree with both of those crowds. I know in my heart, I am quite positive that we have got to be working on both of those.
Yeah, I just want to mention something I've found with a lot of people I talk to and people in the movement. It just seems like it's the old cliche, to a man with a hammer, everything's a nail. So there's a lot of people from whatever industry they're in, whatever field they're in, think they have the magic bullet solution within their field. And so if we just take down capitalism, or if we, like you said, if we just deal with overpopulation. So I think that's one way of talking to everybody, saying that, look, you're not wrong, but we need all of this. We need it all on the table, and we can't think there's one way to fix anything. It reminds me of our obesity epidemic. And if you remember, I think it started in the 90s. It was all low sugar. No, not low sugar, low fat. And it was like, okay, we're going to take on this obesity epidemic. We could still eat all the same stuff, and it's just all about the fat. And that proved to be totally wrong. And we still do that with diets and stuff. But it's like we're approaching the environment in the same way.
I really like that analogy very much. Yeah. Because people just it's very easy to say, okay, I'm going to eliminate all of this stuff. I don't have to worry about any of this. All I have to do is just hyper-focus on this one thing. Right. And that makes it very, very easy, right? If we can just say, it's just capitalism. I'm only going to devote my time and energy to just this. That would be, an efficient use of my time, but I can't do it by myself. I also need to make friends with the people who are population sustainability advocates. I need to make friends with people who want to talk just climate, or people who want to talk about biodiversity loss. Like, everybody should have their area of focus, and it shouldn't be a competition of who's going to save the planet first. It should be like, saving the planet is such a huge job. We all need to get together and come up with solutions that we all have the same goal. So we just need to find a way of getting there together.
Can I say one more thing, Dave? Like you mentioned about that we don't all have the solutions, and I'm glad you said that, because we have suggestions, but no one has a solution, or else we'd be doing it. However, there's institutional reasons we can't. But the other thing is, I think we need to realize that we may not save the planet. We may not save our species or other species on the planet, but if we're moral people, if we're compassionate people, if we love other humans and other species, then we're still going to fight to do what we can. It may not be a win. We may be too late. But, there's some people who are trying to throw in the towel and say, well, it's too late. We can't do anything. You might be right. But what else can you do if you're a moral person and you care? Then just keep working on it and at least alleviate the pain and suffering of many people and other species on the planet.
We sometimes get accused of that, honing in on one thing at the expense of others, and this is the thing we tend to hone in on. We don't think that we have all the answers, but I think pretty much everybody here today would agree that we can at least identify the fact that that's not sustainable. Seeking perpetual growth. And of course, degrowth wouldn't be perpetually sustainable either. And so you basically have one alternative, and it accommodates concerns for both population and GDP, population times per capita consumption. And anyway, that middle path, if you will, that one sustainable alternative to unsustainable growth and unsustainable degrowth, well, that's what we call the steady state economy. We kind of start with that framework and say that our policy tools, our specific proposals, our cultural reforms, and all the other stuff, if they're not congruent with the transition from either unsustainable growth to a steady state economy, then we have a problem. We're not saying that's everything. There are other prerequisites, like renewable energy actually is, ironically enough, in this context of most of us really appreciating Planet of the Humans, the thing I think that we appreciate the most is that you can't have bountiful, any kind of energy. There are limits to what the planet can handle and how much economic growth you can have, no matter what the energy source is or how clean or green it may be. So we do need a conscientious transition to renewable fuels, but not coupled with the goal of growth, not pursuant to a program of green growth. That's what really irks us at CASI, and that was what was the best thing about Planet of the Humans, we felt, was that it puts the lie to that notion of green growth.
I think we had one or two questions during the initial webinar about degrowth, because we talked about that a little bit, and some people were curious about where CASI stands on that. So maybe you can clarify, Brian. I don't think just because CASI is the Center for the Advancement of the Steady State Economy, I don't think you're saying let's stabilize the global economy at today's rate of economic throughput.
You're correct. We don't. We wish that a steady state economy had been seriously undertaken. It's going back to like the 60s when there was some preliminary talk about that. But now, this many decades later, we're beyond long-run economic and ecological capacity for an $88 trillion economy. So we agree with the degrowthers, who primarily are in Europe. The degrowth movement has many aspects to it, political and economic and technical, but we agree with them at least on the approach of degrowth toward a steady state economy now. We overgrew ecological capacity. Now some degrowth is needed to get to a sustainable size of global and many of the national economies, Chinese, American, Russian.
Well, thanks for that clarification. So I'd like to propose that let's talk about that first. Let's talk about the bucket of contracting our global economy, which means production, consumption. It means individual behavior as well as some system things. I think we'll probably propose some changes in all of those areas, and I'll open the floor for anybody to start with some of their recipes for future success.
Could I just mention one thing? Not really a suggestion, but along with what Brian said, I see a lot of the younger generation now who's in the environmental movement sort of reinventing the wheel. And like Brian said, he wishes the steady state happened 40 years ago or 50 years ago. And I think what we need to do is go back to some of the people and the ideas that have been around for 30, 40, 50, 60 years, because it's not that those are the ideas that failed. It's that those ideas were fought against institutionally and politically and economically. And many of these ideas are the solutions or are part of the solutions. And for people who are younger, who may have not gone back to old people in the movement and old texts that have been written about in the environment, I think that's the place to start with solutions. And we have to remember that all of these people and all of these writings, it's there, and you don't need to reinvent the wheel. It's just that we didn't have the political will and the institutional will and the economic favor to do this kind of stuff.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. I think it would behoove many of us to go back and reread Small is Beautiful, read everything that Herman Daly has written, that's for sure. And in fact, let's make a promise that in the show notes, we'll include a goldmine of links, not only to some good reading, but I think we should make a point of helping to point people to some organizations that are working on some of the aspects that we talk about. So if we bring up a solution and we know of an organization or an alliance that's doing particularly good work, let's try to mention it here, or at the very least, circle back and put links in the show notes about those.
I am looking at an exhaustive list well, not an exhaustive list, but I think a list that we can continue to add to of just really good ideas. I don't think we're short of having really great ideas here. Many of these ideas are coming from Kristine, so I'm just going to go ahead and talk about those. But a couple of them, I think eliminating advertising and marketing was something that I'm a little stuck on, as well as something like replacing entertainment production and consumption with other local forms of entertainment and art and leisure play. I'm just trying to imagine what the world would look like without huge industries like entertainment and film. I was born in '89, so I've grown up watching movies, and I can't imagine a world where that's not a thing anymore. And it's not just here in the States, it's all around the world. It's people love their movies. And I think really what I need more help with is not so much the ideas, because we have these ideas. We have really great ideas. But I think personally, I need more help with actually how to execute these ideas. And so I try to think about what it means to create systemic change. And I think we at World Population Balance and at GrowthBusters, scholars like Kristine and Brian are really great at educating the public and making sure that everything that we all do is available to the public. And I think that's the first step, making sure that it's not on some academic or policy high tower, that everything that we have to say is available for the masses. That's the first step in getting actual change to happen. But I think really what we need a little bit more help with is getting the attention of stakeholders and policymakers and actually getting these ideas out there. So I don't think we have a problem with ideas. We can come up with ideas all day long. And I think that's really what a lot of our listeners wanted us to talk about, was how do we actually put these ideas into action? And personally, that's just what I struggle with. I don't have a policy background. And so I started thinking a little bit more about it, like, how do we do this? How do we actually get this stuff going? And I think it also, step 2 of that, I think, would just be building more coalitions with other organizations, other nonprofits, other research, policy, and advocacy organizations. Maybe they're not exactly on the same page as we are with promoting sustainable population or environmental goals, but there is something, there's some overlap. So I think if the more that we connect with other people who are not exactly like us, maybe even people who we wouldn't think we would have anything in common with, I think that's really the future with actually getting these changes.
Yeah, I'll say something to that, because we've identified the things we really liked about Planet of the Humans. It wasn't perfect, and one imperfection, as I see it, that has totally escaped the discussion that I've seen just about anywhere. I think it was Jeff Gibbs himself. He said something to the effect, when he met with the sociologist in the sociologist's office, he said something like, the right has religion. Our side says that we have to have solar panels and wind towers. Okay. Now, I didn't think that was necessary because, first of all, he said the right has religion and they have a belief in infinite fossil fuels. Well, it hasn't been just the right. It's been pretty much the two-party system that's had this notion of perpetual GDP growth. So that's one thing. The other thing is, it's not just the right that has religion. You know, everybody has probably something, some sort of faith, some kind of spirituality. And furthermore, I want to say that at its core, sustainability is really a conservative endeavor. Mm-hmm. So there are a lot of individuals and organizations on the so-called right that are right on board with us about wanting to conserve the environment, but they have had their hands full of separating the wheat from the political chaff in terms of recognizing that they in many cases do have more things in common with environmental protection efforts and organizations than they do it with the party that has stolen that word conserve. So that's one thing. And then I also wanted to address Erica's search for really specific kinds of things. So we have gone so far as to take this step of posting for public comment the beginnings of the Steady State Transition Act. It goes by several names. The formal title would be the Full and Sustainable Employment Act. And then it's got the acronym FSEA, and we just call it the Full Seas Act because it builds upon the old rising tide lifts all boats metaphor. We say that that metaphor is a 20th century metaphor. Now the seas are full, the tide is fully risen, and so on. So we have Section 2 laid out here. Section 2 is the portion of a paradigm shifting statute that contains the findings and declarations of Congress. So it sort of contains the spirit of the law, and it lays out the basic principles that the rest of the policy will handle in detail. And so, you know, the findings of Congress here are that there's a limit to growth and conflict between growth and environmental protection, and as well as long-term economic sustainability. But I'm going to go right away to the declarations where Congress declares that, for example, the President's Cabinet, Council of Economic Advisors, etc., will immediately cease and desist from developing strategies and initiatives to grow or stimulate the economy. And then the existing such policies, programs, and projects will be phased out. And then we have very specific proposals for what to do after that, including two really key reports that we envision laying the path or identifying the pathway to the transition to a steady state economy. First is this report on federal growth incentives, and then is the report on sustainable population and optimal GDP. And you'll see that we have this not in the hands entirely of the Fed or the Council of Economic Advisors. In fact, we want that to be chaired by the Secretary of the Interior. So we have some real economy estimates. There are some great units in, for example, the USGS that can really produce a report like this, a very solid report like this. And then we need to establish a commission on economic sustainability that takes those two reports and prepares then a 25-year steady state transition plan that's delivered to the president and acted upon thereafter. So all the levers and buttons and switches that are currently set for 3% GDP growth as a goal, those are ratcheted downward to a steady state economy for starters. And then there's degrowth in the background is probably going to happen whether we like it or not. But there's got to be congruence with our central economic policy of the United States.
Well, we're experiencing a little degrowth right now with the COVID-19 shutdown. So we're ratcheting back a little bit, and maybe if people embrace enough of the things that in our bucket, I guess you could call it a bucket list in a way, in our shrink the economy bucket, then we might be able to keep that going. But I'm really glad that you showed us that, Brian, because this is practical, on the ground solution, and it's a solution to probably the biggest item on our list in this bucket, and that is this worship of GDP growth, that's our metric for success, and that GDP growth, robust GDP growth, is the most universal public policy goal.
Yeah, and we're constantly torn in two directions because a lot of us at CASI, we feel that there's still a lot of paradigm shifting that has to happen first before we start getting very serious about specific policy reforms. But we also have a lot of people that are saying, hey, you can't just talk all the time about limits to growth, and you got to start identifying the policies then that move toward a steady state economy. So we're trying to handle that balance of both.
So we'll include links to help people to get on board and learn more about your practical proposal. And this is really addressing one of the systemic issues. This strikes me as a little more challenging if somebody sitting at home watching this or listening to this is trying to figure out, okay, what can I do tomorrow morning to move us in the right direction? It's going to be a little harder for them to get their hands around that. But I'm guessing there are some things that individuals listening to this or watching this could do to help move that along. Are there?
Well, if they're consumers, which they all are, they can do less, less consumption. But if they want to, they're going to have to explore the organization, the right organizations to join. That's part of it, right? They're members of the Sierra Club. The Sierra Club has been intransigent in their notion of green growth. We've tried and tried and tried for a couple of decades to get them to weigh in on limits to both population and economic growth. They won't have it. Dave, you're saying, what can the person do tomorrow? If they're a Sierra Club member, get out of it. Join CASI, support GrowthBusters, World Population Balance, any of the organizations that really are honed in on raising awareness of limits to growth and doing things about it, like the Full Seas Act and the Convention on Economic Sustainability. That's another one.
And I'd love to spend more time talking about ways individuals can consume less.
I guess I have a question too. For anyone who might be afraid of moving towards a steady state economy, maybe they agree with everything that it stands for, but maybe what's preventing them from moving forward is not having any idea of what that looks like, what that sort of system looks like in real time under their present environmental and social context. For anybody who is kind of 50-50 with it, like, this is a great idea, but how will this actually act out and play out in my life, in society? Are there any examples of what this could look like? I think that's another way for us to kind of move forward towards change, is if we can somehow demonstrate examples of what this looks like. Not exactly, because I think, we can refer to other countries like Spain or other places that are way ahead of us on this, but this isn't Spain. So I think that's what people are going to always, that's going to be their argument. Well, this isn't Spain. It's not like that. And nothing will ever, there are never going to be like two things that are exactly alike, two countries that are exactly alike, but probably the closest thing that we can get to showing an example of what it could be like, I think will kind of alleviate a lot of anxieties that people have.
Well, so in a way, there's an example out every window. You want a steady state economy, or if you think you might and you're kind of 50-50 on it, open your window and look outside. You like what you see? And if you like it, then you want a steady state economy. Because what's going to destroy what you see is the perpetual push for growth. If you
That's
don't
great.
like what you see, well, maybe there's been too much growth already. So you do the next best thing, which is try to, stabilize it now or get some degrowth to a more sustainable or a more optimal steady state economy.
But there are some examples out there of nations that are further along the curve than we are, right? Would you hold any of those up as good examples, even though, Erica, you're right, especially in the U.S., where we're among the world's biggest pigs. We're very quick to dismiss something that Europeans are doing. But long question and probably a shorter answer, Brian. So what are some of the good examples out there?
Well, this case of Spain is starting to intrigue me more and more. Steady state Spain, I'm hoping, is what it becomes. The expert on this, I would say, is Dan O'Neill. He has, for a number of years now, really analyzed which nations out there approach in terms of the size of the economy of steady state, but also politically, are they aligned with those kinds of goals? So yeah, you want a short answer. Bhutan, of course, it always comes up as the beautiful example of a nation that has gone toward gross national happiness. Another real common example is New Zealand, where Ardern, the prime minister, announced that they're not in pursuit of GDP growth now with their fiscal policy. Thailand, we talked about, Kristine mentioned early scholars, and somebody mentioned small is beautiful. And Schumacher spent a lot of time in Thailand and trying to get appropriate technology. And the king of Thailand at the time was very, I would say, influenced by that and called for what they called the sufficiency economy. And so there are plenty of examples around the planet. Bolivia introduced the Harmony with Nature initiative in the UN, and they were very much aligned with the steady state economy.
I know genuine progress indicators have been kind of on the map for over a decade. I know Canada has attempted to adopt them, and I don't think they ever did finally complete that. I think the state of Maryland has somehow officially blessed genuine progress indicators. Is that something that people should get behind, or is that really too much of a half step?
I think it is something they should get behind. Once in a while you hear people say we should just get rid of GDP and just measure GPI or some other favored metric. We like to say, well, don't throw away GDP. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, in the sense that GDP is a great indicator of environmental impact. And so it's kind of like an obese patient on a scale. You don't throw away the scale. I think you need to monitor ever more when there's such a health issue, a planetary health issue. Really got to monitor GDP. That's why, we have the old rolling GDP meter up here. And we used to play what we called the alarm sequence. Anytime you would come to the website, GDP would come out of nowhere, this rolling GDP meter, and there was this really scary music, but too many people thought it was kind of crazy. So we set that to the side, but we still have the rolling GDP meter. And, this is the only previous 12 months live, real-time rolling GDP meter on the internet. And we're just trying to show look how fast the thing is going and how much of a threat it is to environmental protection, economic sustainability, and national security, and international stability. We actually had to put this thing in reverse. I don't know if anybody was paying enough attention to notice. It's rolling in reverse now because of the COVID-caused recession. Yeah, and we have it on a very aggressive recessionary schedule. We kind of explain that a little bit here. But we'll be, unfortunately, I would imagine, putting it back into forward gear sometime after the COVID pandemic.
But I'm glad you brought that up, Brian, about how you've got it reversing right now. And I'm interested in everyone's take on the news that China has decided to, I'm afraid it's probably temporary, but they're not chasing GDP growth. They've said they're not going to be worried about that this year. What are the two things that they're more worried about, which are more appropriate, that have more to do with well-being, employment, or something like that? Has anyone noticed that?
I hadn't heard about that. That's terrific. You know, the skeptic in me, again, I can't help but wonder if that is in response to how our administration is handling things and they're trying to make a big contrast.
Well,
You know?
plus they probably don't want to, my fear is they don't want to shine a big headlight on the fact that they're not going to achieve 6% GDP growth this year, that
Right.
they still look at that as a failure. But, you know, I'm hoping a little bit of a recurring theme in this conversation is for us to be watching for things that are happening that are sort of being forced on us now with the COVID-19 shutdown that we might want to keep. And I would think one of those would be China gets out of the habit of advertising and pursuing GDP growth.
Of course, another one on a smaller level is opening up urban centers to walking and biking and getting rid of the cars. There were places that have done that over the last 10, 20 years, but now it's really booming because of the shutdown. And that's something that's great to see, that people are thinking about that more. And remembering that in many areas of many countries, you can walk and bike and find other modes of transportation, and you don't have to get into a car. You know, in America, there's rural areas. Even the area I'm in is not very walkable. But before I came to where I am right now, I almost always tried to be in a place where I could commute by foot. And we forget that that's so easy, and we don't take the time to do that. And it's great to see all these urban centers that are embracing that now.
Yeah, and one of the big drivers of that, I think, is the fact that everybody knows that people are going to be reluctant for a long time, who knows, maybe for a really long time, to get on a crowded subway train or a crowded bus. And, you know, that's one of our little techno solutions to having too many people is, well, stay out of your car, use public transportation, and your footprint will be a little bit smaller. So now we're going to have that challenge. So I think it's pretty cool that the one solution they've come up with so far is to make it more attractive for people to be on foot or on bicycle. Are all those commuters going to embrace that? Is there anything we can do to help that along and hang on to that?
I think as it
Tell
starts...
you what happens in the DC Beltway, you know, when this pandemic winds down, or which hopefully it does with a vaccine and stuff. But I'm afraid there's going to be first a huge upswing in the, single person per car sort of commuting.
Yeah.
Yeah. I share the appreciation where they are doing that, you know, moving toward opening up the downtown areas mostly to walking and biking and stuff. That's spectacular. So I wonder in the net, you know, nationally, whether it would be more of that or even more commuting. It's an interesting question.
Well, good point, because you're in DC where there are people who have a 2-hour one-way commute. They're insane. I don't know what you're doing there, Brian. And
well,
I think
I should clarify. I'm like Kristine. I rode my bike to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service headquarters for like 15 years.
Good for you.
Yeah, now my knees are going bad, so I started having to drive about 3 miles to get to the Cassie office. But right now, everybody's doing telework with this pandemic. So once again, you know, it helps to show a certain sort of supra-economic silver lining, not to the pandemic, but to the recession part of the pandemic.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up, because I think that is ultimately going to be the solution. Because if everybody stays off of the trains and the subway and the buses in really packed places like the DC area, and they try to go in their car, it will become a 5-hour commute. So the only solution is to work from home. And we're proving really a great proof of concept going on right now is that so many people do not need tons of steel carrying them 20 miles to an office that you don't even need to have heated and air conditioned and powered. So I think that's going to be one of the biggest lessons and biggest helpers going forward with shrinking that part of the consumption pie. Another one I'll bring up while I'm on my rant about that is, business travel. It's always bugged me that all these road warriors, every Monday, the airports are used to be jammed with all of these business people who spent the week meeting face to face with their customers. And not to mention all of the people who would travel to a convention or a conference or what have you. And everybody's had to find another way to do that. And so my hope and recommendation is to not lose track of that. That's a habit that I think we want to keep.
Mhm. I do think we do need to think about, though, and this is hard to say because no one wants to hear this either, but the ecological footprint of this technology that we're on. Because this is not good either. And if you forget, because you have a small computer or a smartphone or a tablet, but you forget about the data centers working and taking over the land and using all of that energy. And even if it's clean energy, it's land use, it's deforestation, it's resource use to keep all of this going. And I think one thing we have to start thinking about is jobs, and are all these jobs necessary? Certainly everybody needs to make a living and everybody needs to have a certain standard of life that we don't even give to the American population, let alone the world. It's horrific, the inequality now. But at the same time, part of the problem that's creating this ecological dysfunction is we have all of these unnecessary and useless and harmful jobs. And there was a book out in the past couple of years called Bullshit Jobs that talked about that a bit.
That. He's an anthropologist.
Is it David Graeber who wrote it? Is that his name?
You know, I don't know, but I know I heard him on a podcast, and brilliant person, anthropologist.
I haven't been able to read the full book. I read excerpts, and I know that he talks a lot about all of these unnecessary jobs that people do just because we need to have jobs for people. And certainly if you've lived long enough, you've probably seen this at play or been in one of those jobs. But the other thing is that we forget that a lot of jobs are actually doing a tremendous amount of harm to people and to the planet. As a matter of fact, there was this manifesto written by French students who were at some of the top schools in France, urging other students at universities across the globe to propose to all of their potential employers that they need to do something about their work and their work environments and keep ecology and the environment in mind, because they don't want to go into these jobs that are harmful, and that these big corporations that are recruiting all of these top level students, these students don't want to go work for them if they're going to be doing harm to the environment. I'll try to find that manifesto, but this is something I think we need to think about in terms of jobs. So many jobs are actually harmful.
Yeah, and another good subject that you brought up there is the jobs. And for a long time, we've known, or should have known, that we should have been turning all of our productivity gains into fewer work hours, but instead we turned it into super overconsumption. We kept working just as much or more, and now everybody's got a vacation home in the ski resorts and a vacation home in the desert so they can get away from the cold, and $5 cups of coffee are a necessity, and expensive fashions and all of that stuff. Well, I think you called it frivolous, didn't you, Kristine? Frivolous consumption. What we should have been doing was just taking it easy and working less, which would have kept our footprint from getting so big. But also, there's a whole lot more joy, it turns out, in porch sitting, reading a good book, or going for a good walk, getting some exercise. So much more joy in that than there is on working yourself to death and then, hopping on Amazon and spending all that money. But we've got a serious unemployment issue now, and I think a short term that could be converted into a long-term solution would be job sharing. All along, we should have been working on that, and I don't know what the mechanism is to pull it off, but I think an individual who thinks about it and says, yeah, Dave, you got a good one there, put that in the bucket. If you happen to have a job, but your company is furloughing some of your fellow workers or even laying them off, could you say, hey, could I cut back to half time and share my job with one of those workers who otherwise is going to have to become unemployed? Now, there's a lot of things that have to work if you're going to do that. You've got to make sure that you're not in debt up to your eyebrows. You've got to make sure that you can afford to take a pay cut in order to do that.
This is not quite ready to roll completely yet, but we're going to be working on this real soon. We'll take the precedent of the efforts of the American Cancer Society, and I believe it was in concert with the Surgeon General, and certainly with collaboration by many school systems, the social construction of the smoker. And Dave, I don't know, maybe you have seen some of these. Kristine and Erica probably haven't. I saw them roaming the halls at Lombardi Junior High in
Are you
Green
calling
Bay,
me
Wisconsin.
old? You're calling me old.
Well, all is relative, So, but here's a couple of things to take note of with regard to limits to growth. Smoking and conspicuous consumption have a lot in common. They're both conspicuous, they both impact public health, and they both can be socially constructed. And Dave, you remember this book. You like this book, and you may recall that fully half of it was all about developing an attitude toward consumption. And I wish more people had listened, because you may have noticed that, if it had worked, we may have a different government today. The idea here was the lower 80 percentile in personal consumption expenditures, the steady staters, as we call them, they would begin to develop this attitude, that not going out and shooting people or vandalism, but a socially present awareness and reaction toward that liquidating type of behavior. We call it the liquidating class, because when you're consuming with expenditures of hundreds of millions of dollars a year, that requires, because of the trophic structure of the economy, a great deal of liquidation of natural capital at the base, wood, waters and soils and fisheries and so on, to generate the money to be, buying Learjets and flying all over in them and so on. And so there are options that we have for both the carrot and the stick approach to getting toward a more sustainable level of consumption per capita.
I'm pretty sure Kristine and Erica would be on board with that kind of thinking based on previous comments.
Well,
Yes.
I would have to say, if anybody isn't, they ought to ask themselves this question, because some people have told me, you know what, Chuck, just forget about all that psychology stuff, to focus on your public policy. But I say, what about this? Is this guy going to get anywhere trying to move that horse? Or here we have empirical evidence that this doesn't work. There's one clear winner here. You got to put the horse before the cart. You have to have a big, strong political horse to pull that cart of public policy.
Brian, I just got to applaud you. You're the Will Rogers of steady statesmanship, I think. Got a good sense of humor. I appreciate that.
I want to go back to jobs real quick. Kristine had a really good idea about, I think Andrew Yang had the idea of UBI. And, when I think about these useless jobs or, bullshit jobs, the episode I listened to on that, I think the most frustrating thing about that episode was that people take on these jobs, and these jobs weren't even meant to actually fulfill some function. Like people, and they're well paid, right? They're getting paid X amount of money to sustain their lifestyle in American culture. And they go to work almost feeling exhausted because they don't have any use. They go to work just to sit there being a mannequin. And it's really kind of just a status symbol. A receptionist, for example, they'll hire receptionists or administrators when you don't even really need all those people to do the work that they're hired to do, because there's just not enough of the work. It's really just almost a status symbol. It makes the company look more successful if there's somebody up in the front looking like they're busy, and they're giving them all this busy work just so that they can kind of keep this illusion of success going. But it's absolute bullshit. And I think that people wouldn't feel as inclined to take on these jobs. Well, not even inclined, but like they have to take on these jobs because they have to support themselves. They have to pay for their families, their, whatever it takes, even as a single, just to survive. So I think if we had a system in place where housing was actually, a human right, and everybody had adequate housing, that would solve a lot of our problems too. And not treating, this was Kristine's idea, but not treating housing as a market commodity. And the number of people I know that want to go into real estate or say, gosh, if I had X amount of money, what would I do with it? Oh, I'd go into real estate, because the system rewards that. And you can make a ton of money just by buying a bunch of property and selling it for like X times the amount of what the property is worth.
Boy, I have to say, I think even universal basic income, I would put in the long shot mini bucket inside this bucket and
Sure.
getting rid of the bullshit jobs. Of course, kind of the main challenge in all of that is everybody needs meaningful work and they need to have enough income to meet their needs. So the universal basic income would go a long way toward helping with that. But it's going to be a tough sell in a place like the United States.
Well, it's interesting, though. Andrew Yang brought it up this round, but it's been around since, Nixon, I think? I think that's when it first came around, and it was Milton Friedman may have been the one who originally introduced it. And, if we had a universal basic income, it would need a lot of guardrails around it and to make it work for real people and not work for just the people on the top. But I think that is something that if we could get it out there, and there's a lot of people still talking about it and have been talking about it in recent years, that could help a lot. And then there's also, I think it was Venezuela and or Ecuador and or Bolivia, where they are paying people who are not traditionally paid, like women who stay home and take care of their children. I mean, there's so many forms of work, and I don't know about you, but I've done work my whole life that has been unpaid, all sorts of work. And we all do work. And the idea that we have to do these jobs that these people at the top dictate, and like I said, many of which are tremendously harmful and mind draining and, so hard for the people who do manual labor and manual work and repetitive stress kinds of things. We really need to rethink our whole job system and our employment system and what it's for and who created it. It's funny because we cannot seem to get out of this mindset. And I think it's a psychological thing. We've only been doing this kind of stuff for a very short blip in the history of humans. We've been around for Homo sapiens 200,000 years. But we look at this industrial society, and even prior to that, just when we started agriculture and feudalism and that kind of thing, we look at this as the only way to live and the only kind of thing that's available to human society. And I think we need to expand that. Of course, that's a very hard sell. Universal basic income is a hard sell. But Brian was talking about changing these kinds of mindsets is something to get out there. And I think the only way to do it is to, when people bring up a lot of these internalized beliefs and conventional wisdoms, you have to have the courage to challenge that, whether it be with people you talk to, friends, family. And it's hard. It is very hard. But it's the only way we can change what's going on, because we have internalized so many insane kinds of things and insane ways of living. And the biggest internalization is we are born, and especially the sort of elite class, you have a child, you want to send that child to the best schools, you want to get them into the best nursery school and go to the best, often private schools, to get to the best colleges, to get this job that will give them a certain way of life and afford them a certain way of life, which we know these kinds of lives are totally unsustainable and totally harmful to the environment. And that whole paradigm of what we are born to do, I think we need to challenge that.
Absolutely.
Well, the fact that you're not getting thrown off the internet, just uttering those words is a sign that we're making some progress. You haven't lost all credibility coming up with these, that these ideas are going to sound pretty crazy to some people, but they're part of the public conversation. And I want to tie a couple things together. Brian talked about the kind of the status that we have conferred on the wealthy. And in the book, Shoveling Fuel for a Runaway Train, which is one of my favorite books of all time, talked about the idea of maybe we could find a way to shame the people who are the extremely wealthy and the conspicuous consumers. And Erica, you brought up, and we didn't fully flesh out, the notion of eliminating advertising, which Kristine had on her list. Well, Kristine's not the first person to come up with that crazy idea, which is brilliantly crazy. But the reason for that, really, the reason that would be a big solution to our overconsumption problem is that advertising makes us want what we don't need. That's what it's designed to do. And so much of our consumption is about status seeking, that if we can find a way to turn it upside down so that we admire the people who are living simply and we are ashamed of the people who are wasting so many resources, then I think that will help shift the whole culture.
I wanted to mention something about that. On a personal level, I haven't had a television in 15 years. And I'm someone who was brought up as a teenager, loving television, loving film. I thought I could never live without it. Of course, I can still watch things on the internet, and I still have the internet, but we all think we're not affected by advertising. And I have to say, I can see the difference not having these ads from television that have been gone from my life for a very long time, and having all the ads blocked on the internet. And when I watch things on the internet, which I do, I mostly watch shows and programs without any advertising. And I've recently come back to be in the presence of a television, and I really see the difference and the things that I haven't been affected by it, and how it's enabled my mindset to be different, because I think it doesn't affect me, but when I see a television, I can see that it can subtly affect me, and it hasn't been for a long time, and we all think it doesn't. And if it didn't, they wouldn't have created this multi-billion dollar industry. It does affect us, and it does permeate the way we think about things and the way we think about society, personally and in a bigger scale. So, and I wanted to mention Sao Paulo, Brazil, this might have been like 10 years ago, got rid of all of their billboard advertisements. So that was something that they actually did to affect some change. So these things are not impossible.
Did you guys notice Kristine sliding her Gucci handbag out of camera view a minute ago?
Kristine, I also haven't had a television in years. I'm also probably, Dave knows I'm guilty of this, of not having most social media outlets because it just doesn't make me happy. Like everywhere you look, there's an advertisement of Gucci handbags, or, you know, you're not this enough, you're not that enough. And it just doesn't make you happy. Like there have been studies to show that people's mental health declines over time with being bombarded with all of these online messages via social media, but television, I'm sure, is probably just as bad. I'll get a television when there is actually a good show or a series that celebrates child-free living, maybe something that isn't just your typical show or television series that's on. And
that's exactly what Population Media Center has done quite successfully for some decades now. They actually have what do you call those things? Soap operas. And a few countries in South America, I think, that really managed to deliver the message in soap opera style about having less kids. Dave, you were wondering about places and projects that are really worthwhile. You know, I've been mentioning us and you and World Population, but there is Population Media Center for sure.
Yeah. And I don't want to belabor the consumption thing too much, but there is one other thing that I'd like to put in the bucket. I wish that we had 100 top journalists watching this, because then I would say to you journalists, you are the storytellers, you're the keepers of our culture in so many ways. And we see in the reporting around the COVID-induced recession, the bad, it's presented as bad news that housing starts are down, that people are buying fewer new cars. And so what's everybody's goal is to get everybody back to the mall, to get everybody shopping. And it's going to be up to you journalists whether that is portrayed as good news or bad. And I guess you can't get away from the fact that in some respect, if it brings somebody's job back, there is a good news component of it. But we need reporting to start acknowledging that there is another side to that story, that it is as much, maybe more bad news than it is good if we go back to our old ways of buying crap that we don't need.
I have to give a shout out to the SEJ, the Society of Environmental Journalists, because while many still don't get all the way to the big picture of limits to growth and the conflict between economic growth and environmental protection, more and more, I think SEJ is, more and more of their members. Their conference this fall in Boise was going to be something about beyond limits or something like that. It was more about like limits to urban growth and so on, but they certainly are familiar with the topic now. And so anybody out there on the podcast that may be looking for a good, solid journalism organization to join and help along in that project of getting limits to growth into the story. See, we always think that for a lot of the environmental news out there, all it takes is two things to deliver a limits to growth message: different opening and a different closing. A context that says, because of the growth economy, now there's all these forever chemicals and, the greenhouse gas emissions there and so on. And then at the end, you can point out there are efforts to reduce the level of these, but on the other hand, the overriding domestic goal is GDP growth. So in ecological macroeconomics, they're saying that it's going to be very difficult to ever address this problem without addressing that, that kind of thing. Every environmental journalist out there, in other words, has a real natural nexus with limits to growth. All they have to do is a little bit of homework on that. They can really go to town with that.
It's too bad that it's hard enough to get the environmental journalists to tell the whole story. And we really do need the Associated Press financial and economic reporters and the Reuters reporters who are every quarter writing those stories about the latest GDP figures. And I guess if we can get public policy to shift, then the reporting will shift a little bit. But there's, they ought to be ashamed of themselves, those reporters who are just reporting on religion, this irrational faith in everlasting economic growth. They're reporting on that as though it's a universal truth. And they don't have to do that, even if the policymakers still believe in that.
Well, and then there's the whole media propaganda model that Herman and Chomsky have talked about. We're so tied to our jobs, and the reporters know that if they come at it at an angle like that, they're not going to have their job, because especially as media has become consolidated and the big companies that own the media outlets own all of these other businesses. And I guess that this is why somehow, and I don't have the solution, we have to decouple our basic necessities of life to our employment. We can say we shouldn't have these malls, we shouldn't have these incessant fashion and all of this waste that we create, the 99-cent store, the dollar stores with all their little trinkets and all of their plastic. We cannot sustain life like that. But we also have to think about all these poor people who are working at these very minimum wage jobs, who are barely making a living and need to do this job at this moment. And we have to find a way to get people the basic necessities. And I wish I had the magic bullet for that, because that would solve a whole lot if we could get people basic necessities and decouple it from that kind of employment that really needs to go.
Well, Kristine, what about salary caps? Do you feel that that's a way to sort of foist some of that money back down to those scenarios? Because the money's got to go somewhere. And if we instituted, what did they say? Bezos is supposed to become perhaps the first trillionaire. Yeah. I mean, there's something wrong, really seriously wrong. If $1 trillion can accumulate in one person's hands. So I think there should be salary caps. We have proposed what we call 15 times salary caps in any particular sector. Nowhere should someone be able to make more than 15 times as much as anybody else in a position in that sector. So like if you're a barber in New York City, you may not survive without charging $150 an hour. You might be able to get by okay with $10 an hour, in places around where I am in Virginia. So there's got to be a significant amount of latitude, but you shouldn't be able to charge $1,500 for a haircut, because that money is not manna from heaven. It required at the base more and more agricultural and extractive surplus to free up that kind of money. It's really hard to get that point across, but
absolutely,
like a co-op model, no? Something.
Literally salary caps, like the National Football League. It seems like a crazy example because there's such gaudy consumption there. But they have one part of it right. They have a salary cap. Not more than X amount can be spent by any one team on salaries, on player salaries at least. The owner, that's a different matter, I guess. But
there are
models out there.
Under Eisenhower, we had a 90% marginal tax rate, and some people are calling for even 100% tax above a certain amount. And this was a Republican. And it's really ironic that we have the Republican doing what we need to do now. And just as we had the Republican Nixon, whose administration put in probably the most comprehensive environmental reforms we've ever had in this country. And we should remember that. This partisan stuff, neither of the parties are doing anything now, but it wasn't the Democratic Party who implemented a lot of these policies that we need to return to.
Good points all. Probably I should force us to spend some time on contracting global population. Are you guys ready to move on? Any last thing that you just absolutely have to mention on the consumption and economic growth side?
One thing I wanted to mention, and I'm not sure I'll be very articulate about it, but I think we need to rein in Wall Street, and we need to do something about that. And one thing I was thinking is we need to bring back Glass-Steagall, because I was thinking about how everybody who has any money and has invested or is looking for a retirement is basically forced into Wall Street now. And that's been a concerted effort to do. And I remember, I'm old enough to remember the times when people got like 7% interest in their savings account and didn't need to invest their money in Wall Street. And that, I believe, is because of the repeal of Glass-Steagall that all of this happened. And Wall Street is really a menace. And I think we need to put reins on Wall Street if we're going to do anything for the environment. And what I mentioned is just one of those reins.
Yeah, unfortunately, that reminds me, we probably need to put doing away with fractional reserve banking in this bucket too, don't we, Brian?
Yeah, because if you have a loose reserve requirement, basically you're in a perpetual state of debt, whereby there must be more and more production, greater and greater GDP to pay that off. So yeah, having 100% reserve requirement is a part of monetary reform toward a steady state economy.
And I want to mention, we are going to include links to some of the good organizations doing good work on all of these things. I don't know if the Work Less Party in Vancouver, Canada is still around or not, but I'll go look them up and try to include some resources about job sharing. Juliet Shore wrote a great book called Plenitude, where she talks a lot about the benefits of working less and doing more self-provisioning so that you don't have to spend as much money at the supermarket and you have some satisfying labors to do. I think Transition Towns, Transition US and Transition Network are doing really good work on trying to find, reinvent a more localized, resilient, self-sufficient economies. And I think we should mention that it seems like globalization has finally gotten its reputation sullied, and many, many people are getting more excited about the benefits of localization. Who would have thought that President Trump would even toot that horn a little bit? So localization, the Business Alliance for Local Living Economies, we'll include a link to their website. They have a lot of good ideas to help people work on keeping money in town and meeting needs locally. And Brian, I don't know if you know, you're probably a member of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. If we're not, we just haven't done the paperwork yet. Yeah. But yeah, we intended to. And so then there's a slow money movement as part of that too, right? Yep. Yes. And Kate Rayworth's whole donut economics, I think she's starting to even build an organization out of that. That's some really good thinking and good work. So it's going to be a long list of links. But let's talk about population, because the truth is that if we're too uncomfortable dealing with that, and apparently a lot of the renewable energy advocates were pretty uncomfortable with it because they made some really outrageous charges of racism against the filmmakers for bringing up population in Planet of the Humans. They were guilty of talking about overpopulation while being white, which is, it's always good as a filmmaker to have include as many diverse viewpoints as you can. But I think it's racism in itself if you accuse someone of being a racist just because they said something about overpopulation and they weren't dark-skinned. That's just prejudicial. You really need to consider the merits of what they have to say. And of course, World Population Balance, where Erica and I do some of our work with the Overpopulation podcast, we strive to make the conversation sensitive, and diverse, and to really educate people so that they can advocate for population contraction without having a racist component. It doesn't need to be racist. We're overpopulated right here in the United States, even though our birth rate is well below replacement rate. We're such rampant overconsumers that there are too many of us. And if we're too uncomfortable to talk about that and at least make sure that couples making family-size decisions know the facts about overshoot and overpopulation so they can make well-considered, free decisions about family size. If we can't go there and we have to just become a sustainable civilization by reducing consumption, you can do the math. I'm not going to take the time here to go through it. But if you do the math and we do that fairly around the world, we are all going to be living like monks. And I don't think very many people are going to sign up for that. So I think.
Well, the good news is they wouldn't be having much sex. So
yeah, that's true. That's true. That might be a good thing. We've got to not only end population growth, but we need to contract it. And the good news is that you don't have to do anything unethical. You don't have to dictate or legislate family-size decisions. You just need to bring it out from under the rug, make sure people are aware of it, and celebrate small family decisions, support family planning. It would save us more money than it would cost us to make long-acting contraception available free, make it convenient, make it free. There are a few other barriers, but everybody knows that empowering women and gender equity and education are all good things that tend to lead families to make smaller family decisions. And so that's all good. So I think obviously the individual solution, the individual action you can take is if you were thinking about having 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 kids, think again, rethink that. I'm not going to tell you what size your family should be. I think if you are fully informed and you think about it and you don't just make your family size decision out of some default mode or out of response to expectations from society or your parents or grandparents, that I'm pretty confident that you'll make a loving, compassionate decision for the well-being of the child that you might decide to conceive. That's my rant. Anybody?
I don't know if there's anything else to be said. I think you're right. I think it's not something we can dictate. And I think that's why so many people are afraid to talk about it, but it's something that should be talked about. And again, it's not a new concept. And I'm trying to remember the woman's name. It might have been Catherine Brown, who graduated from university in 1968 and was valedictorian and gave her valedictory speech.
Stephanie Mills.
Oh, okay. I was way off. Okay, right. But she said that she was not going to have any children and explained exactly why and brought up the topic way back in 1968, and somehow it's been quashed. And I guess we really have to, again, change some social norms and mindsets to make people realize that it's okay to choose to have 1 or 0 children, and it's not necessarily harmful for the child to be an only child. That's another thing that we kind of tend to think. And that the people who choose this are not necessarily doing it out of complete narcissism and selfishness and just to accumulate more and have a better life for themselves. There's way more to it, and we need to expand that conversation.
I guess adding on to just demonstrating examples of what a cultural shift would look like. I mean, this is like spot on. I think we do need to see more examples that celebrate alternative lifestyles, mainly a small family ethic. I would especially like to see more on the child-free choice. And again, just if we want people to follow along with a news story or actually see it as a positive and not necessarily as something that they're losing. I think that's the problem is when people think about, shrinking their family sizes, they think it is sort of a loss. Like, why would I want to do that? I want to have the freedom to choose. And we are a culture that just overly celebrates our freedom to do whatever we want, whenever we want. And that's all great and dandy. And yes, every woman should have their reproductive power to choose when and if she wants to have children. But we should also be thinking about each other. Having a child is the greatest, most extreme decision that you can make that has massive global impacts. It's not just simply waking up and deciding I'm going to have a kid and it's just going to affect me and my family. It's going to affect the entire planet. And we need to continue to remind ourselves, prospective parents who are thinking about doing that need to think about that. And they need to remind themselves of what that means and what the long-term repercussions of that decision include. And
you want a proposal?
A proposal, another one?
Yeah. Although I want to preface it a little bit. We can't separate the GDP stuff from the population stuff. And there's a reason for that typically goes unnoticed. We have in the Council of Economic Advisors, for example, very neoclassically trained economists. And that means, among other things, they don't have any ecology background. They're not ecological economists at all. And in neoclassical growth theory, you actually need, this is going to blow people away. I think you know where I'm going on this, David. You not only need increasing population to grow the economy, you need an increasing population to grow GDP per capita GDP. And the logic of that in a nutshell is that the more population growth you have, the more you can allocate in terms of brain power to the research and development sector, which is where you get the increasing returns to scale or raising the bar of GDP. So this is how you supposedly get a greater and greater standard of living in GDP per capita terms, even as the population grows. In fact, not only even as, but only if the population grows. So if you're in a cabinet meeting and the president's asking, what can we do here to get the GDP growth rate ratcheted up next year? Your economic advisors are going to tell you, get the population growth rate, not just to have more consumers, but we're going to have more brain power in the R&D sector then.
Yeah,
so we have to get that addressed. We got to replace this crazy neoclassical unlimited growth theory in policy.
So that's just what it's about.
Ought to be enough.
And it is just about growth at that point. It is just this obsession with growth. It is just about the number at that point. It has nothing to do about people. It has nothing to do about making a better life for society and the people living in it. It has nothing to do with better health outcomes or.
Well, there are still politicians that equate winning a Cold War with GDP growth, for example, and defending the nation. But that's also very 20th century. We have to get through to I think there is a lot of military intelligence now that's starting to catch on that was a 20th century approach. And we don't need it. We don't want it anymore because we're only undermining our own, as well as everybody in the world's national security by pushing for GDP growth. But in the Full Seas Act, I just showed you guys Section 2, where we would be establishing that Commission on Economic Sustainability with the EPA administrator and secretaries of Agriculture and Energy and Interior and so on. Well, afterward, when the 25-year steady state transition plan is provided to the president, there's got to be some bureaucratic administration of that. And so we will be proposing the Bureau of Population and Consumption. Yeah, and by the way, not that there will be a bigger government. Right now, there are tons of bureaucrats working in programs on policies that are very pro-growth. We need their expertise. They're the ones that are going to have the insight about how to ratchet that back down. So it's no net gain. I want the conservatives out there to know, no net gain in bureaucracy here. In fact, over time, there would be a reduced bureaucracy. But the Bureau of Population and Consumption, we need to be able to know what sustainable levels are, and then also what different levels are associated with different amounts of well-being.
Most people think that the UN most likely population scenario that shows us hitting almost 11 billion by the end of this century. Most people assume that's baked into the cake and it would take a long time to change that. But the fact is, if we were at a one-child family average today, it would take us less than 100 years to cut the global population in half. We'd be well on our way to something more sustainable. And if you have fewer people, it's easier to shrink the economy. The economy only needs to be big enough to meet the needs of the people. So fewer people, smaller economy. Common sense. And the last thing I'll say about it is we know, everybody knows, that choosing to have one fewer child is the single biggest, most effective way to shrink your carbon footprint. It dwarfs all the other things that you can do in terms of walking, riding your bike, changing your light bulbs, driving a hybrid or an electric car if you have to drive it, et cetera, et cetera. It is really powerful, and it's funny that so many environmental organizations these days spend a lot of time trying to convince everybody that population isn't a part of the solution and we shouldn't talk about it. And the reason people are so ill-informed about it is because these organizations have engaged in shaming. They make it very, very uncomfortable to tell the truth about it. And we witnessed that from the backlash about population being mentioned on Planet of the Humans. And that's going to be with my last dying breath, I'm going to eliminate that shaming and make it okay to tell the truth. Because working on this issue does not mean that you are sitting back, living in high style in the overdeveloped world and forcing brown-skinned people in sub-Saharan Africa to have smaller families. That is not what this is about. This is about all of us working hard to shrink our footprint, get our handle on this obsession with economic growth and our overconsumption, and us choosing to have smaller families, and us supporting and helping people around the world so that they can do the same thing. I don't think they're going to take our advice if we think we've got the problem solved here in the overdeveloped world, because we have some of the hardest work to do yet.
To the point.
Try to hold your applause down. We will include links in the show notes to many of the things we've mentioned. I'm going to include a link to a new piece by Richard Heinberg that I want to recommend called Nobody Takes the Renewable Energy Transition Seriously. He's a fellow at the Post-Carbon Institute and one of the smartest people in the world on all the subjects we've been talking about today, I think. One of the things he writes in that piece is, when our team at Post-Carbon Institute spent a year studying the opportunities and roadblocks of a renewable energy transition, we concluded that industrial nations like the United States would have to scale back their overall energy usage considerably, perhaps by 3/4 or more, in order to get along without fossil fuels. A serious energy transition goal would describe in detail a smaller economy that nevertheless meets people's genuine needs. So I think you'll find that an interesting read. Before we go, though, I want to give a quick word about the two organizations co-hosting this webinar series, and also Brian's organization, who've been so supportive and bring Brian to the table. First, real quickly, the GrowthBusters project, working to help get our society into recovery from growth addiction. We produced the GrowthBusters podcast about sustainable living, produced the documentary GrowthBusters Hooked on Growth, which was released in 2011. We're busy educating people that the scale of the human enterprise has outgrown the planet. We're in overshoot. If we fail to correct that, things will get ugly. They already are. And correcting that can really be a beautiful thing. Learn more at growthbusters.org. And World Population Balance is a nonprofit also working to alert everyone around the world that we can solve human overpopulation voluntarily and ethically by freely choosing small families. A one-child family average for less than 100 years can correct the problem. You can explore the issue at worldpopulationbalance.org. We also produce the Overpopulation podcast. You can find it on Spotify or at worldpopulationbalance.org or your favorite podcast app. And we are running the One Planet, One Child campaign to illustrate what one component of a national project to solve overpopulation might look like. You can visit oneplanetonechild.org to learn more. Brian Check, I'd like to invite you to share a few words about the Center for the Advancement of the Steady State Economy.
if you do go to steadystate.org, you can take one very quick action toward advancing the steady state economy by scrolling to the bottom of the home page. We made this button about as big as you can now. And you will be joining the likes of E.O. Wilson and Jane Goodall and Vandana Shiva and Gus Speth and Bill McKibben, actually, and so many others in calling for the steady state economy as the sustainable alternative to growth. Thank you very much, Dave, for that chance to mention that.
Thanks for your good work. And I noticed you've got an episode of the GrowthBusters podcast right there on the page, too. Thanks for doing that. Well, thank you. Thank you, Brian Check. Thank you, Kristine Mattis. Thank you, Erica Arias. And thank you for watching or listening.
Some may dream to pave mountains and streams, but not me. I'm a growth buster. Some may just want more, but don't know what it's for, but not me. I'm a growth buster. Don't want a solution at the cost of pollution. They think bigger is better at the cost of the weather. But no, not us. We are the growth busters. Calling, 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 calling.